And now it's my pleasure to begin the speaking portion of the evening, or the lecture portion of the evening. And we're very excited tonight to have archaeologist Holly Herbster with us, who's going to be the main presenter. I'm going to do a little introduction on the history side of things, and Holly will pick up with the archaeology. Cameron, is the TV showing the title page? Okay, super, thank you. So the talk tonight is called The Secret of Cellar Holes. In the last few years, we've had the wonderful and sometimes unexpected opportunity to do archaeological digs in Little Compton with the real archaeologists, which is the only way you want to do archaeology, from the Public Archaeology Laboratory in Pawtucket. It is not cheap, it is expensive, so we fundraise for this. And we did one a few years ago at the Manton site on Mullen Hill Road, which was wonderful. And then this year, in 2021, in December, on 3 or 4 of the most beautiful December days you could imagine, I think it was 60 degrees, we did the Church-Collins-Nicholson site on the south side of Meeting House Lane. And that project was funded, by community members, but the analysis, the exhibition that we have going on now at the Wilbur House and tonight's talk is funded in large part by the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities. And then I'm also very excited to see Jason Burchard here tonight, because we had a huge problem with this site in that there were impenetrable 6-foot-high briars over the entire surface. And Jason volunteered to go in there and clean them out. And he did an amazing job. He and his crew, who we might have a crew member here as well, did an amazing job, and we simply could not have done it without them. So I'm very grateful. And I think really well worth mentioning and really speaks to the small town nature of Little Compton, Jason is descended from the family the English family that owned that property, and I'm not sure which side of the family you descend from, but very likely his ancestors lived in the house there. So that's a really cool thing. Combining public archaeology, and it was public because we had a lot of people helping us, including the 8th graders, and public history puts a whole new spin on some of our historical stories and understandings. So there was information that we thought we knew about this site that has changed because of the historical research that we've done and because of the archaeology that we've done, and at least in my opinion, I hope we're not done at that site, because I think there's more that we can learn there. So let me spend 10 minutes going through the history, and then Holly will take over and talk about how the objects that we found, the artifacts that we found, confirm or sometimes challenge the assumptions we make based on the history alone. So first of all, there's a wonderful trail of documents about this property. So it's not hard work researching it. And we're incredibly lucky that we actually have not 1, but 2 images of this lost house. You know, we're working on a hole. There's no trace of the house left any longer, but we have a sketch done by an 11-year-old boy, John Church, who lived next door, in 1854. So 1854 is really early to have an image of the house. And the sketch was particularly useful during the dig because you'll notice there are some little outbuildings to the right of the house. Well, Holly found the foundation for those outbuildings, and we were able to dig around the house and in the outbuildings and learned all sorts of things by being able to do that. And then around 1890, 1880, we start to have glass plate negative photographs in Little Compton. That's the black and white photograph of the house. And if you're really good at looking at details, you'll see that now there's dormers on the house, and the front door has changed. In the sketch, you can see nice old-fashioned hinges on the door. Now it's more of a modern door. Going all the way back, as far as the written record allows, we discover that this property was one of the original 100-acre lots purchased by the proprietors from the Sakonnet people in 1773. They literally had a lottery for the lots, handed them out randomly to the 28 men and 1 woman who made up that company of proprietors. And lot 29, which is where this cellar hole is, fell to Benjamin Church. Benjamin never settled on that property. He either sold or traded it to his brother Joseph. Joseph, if inside the box you see a star, that's where the cellar hole is. Off to the side you'll see another star on what is south of the Commons Road. Joseph Church, the first proprietor, and his wife Mary actually lived and farmed on south of the Commons Road. They didn't need this land that they acquired on West Main Road for themselves, but they went ahead and acquired 300 acres there anyway with the intention of giving it to their sons. And that's what they did. And their son John got the part on the east side of the road that we were interested in. The records indicate very firmly that John is the first English person to build a house on the site. When he passed away in 1756, his will mentions the great brook near to my dwelling house and an orchard by said house. That's an excellent match for the site we were working on. It also says that John and his family members were farmers and weavers, and that's pretty common for Little Compton. His son Benjamin and his wife Judith Peabody inherited the house, but what's interesting about Benjamin is Benjamin considered himself a gentleman. He had reached a level of wealth where he no longer needed to work with his own hands. He had people to do that for him. So though he did live in what was a small, modest house for a while, he quickly sort of grew out of the house, moved to Tiverton and later to Providence, and he sold the house to his first cousin once removed, Ebenezer Church. Ebenezer is fun because Ebenezer lived to be 100 years old. So he stayed in the house for a very long time until his death in 1825. If you look at just the historic records, it looks like the same house. You can see a house, and it's easy to presume it's the same house pass from generation to generation. Holly will question that a little bit, and that's good. So Ebenezer lived to be 100, and that's remarkable. The best story about Ebenezer and his family is that if you read about him in the old histories, it says, and his son Joseph volunteered to substitute for him in the Revolution. And that sounds so noble and so giving of this young man who was, depending on what report you read, either 12 years old or 13 years old. And he volunteered to substitute for his dad in the Revolution. Oh my gosh, like, what an amazing kid. And what was wrong with Ebenezer? Like, why couldn't Ebenezer go? There's a wonderful resource online. You can read people's Revolutionary War pension applications. So that's a primary source right from the horse's mouth. So this is what Joseph says about volunteering. He was 13. They accepted him because he was unusually large for his age, and he subbed for his dad and for any other man in Little Compton that he could convince to let himself sub for them, because he was getting paid men's wages to sit at a neighbor's house and watch the river. That was the extent of his service, over and over and over again, and he made gobs of money doing this. The men in Little Compton loved it because instead of having to sit and watch the river, they could farm and take care of their families and earn some money. But Joseph was an entrepreneur who made quite a good living for himself at the ripe age of 13 during the Revolution, and then proceeded to receive a pension for that service in his older age. Joseph inherits the farm, already has his own house, quickly leaves it to his son Nathaniel. Let's see, right underneath the Ebenezer Church star, 2 houses down, you see Nathaniel Church already has a house, doesn't need his grandfather's house, which is now getting quite old. And so in 1836, Nathaniel sells the house to Primus Collins and his wife Elizabeth. Primus Collins is a free black man, one of the few free black families still living in Little Compton in 1836. And we'll talk about Primus in just a minute. Interestingly, the 1831 map and the 1844 map do not show the house. But there's an 1836 deed that absolutely says there's a house on the property. So good lesson that as wonderful as maps are, you cannot count on them to be fully accurate. And I've noticed many, many times that modest houses are just not listed on our local maps. So Primus Collins was enslaved Primus Collins was born during the Revolution. He was enslaved in the household of John Collins of Newport, who was the governor of Rhode Island at that time. John Collins enslaved 13 people, Primus's parents and their 11 children. Newport was in tough shape during the Revolution. They were under siege. After the siege, they were suffering. They had no food, no money. John Collins freed Primus, who was 4. He gave his freedom papers to Primus's mother, Phyllis. Phyllis is an enslaved woman in a war-stricken, impoverished community. How is she going to feed this free child? She looks for other ways, other resources. And she indentures him with a contract to William Richmond of Little Compton. The Richmonds have no children. They take Primus as a 4-year-old indentured servant. He lives on Treaty Rock Farm, grows up there. And when Primus's contract is over, in this case at age 18, which is a little early, Primus is a free man. There's an old story that says the Richmonds gave him a farm. Not true. The Richmonds gave him a half an acre of land. Primus worked and saved and purchased 8 different properties over the course of his lifetime, including the 25 acres on Meeting House Lane, which was his biggest holding. Primus owned 2 houses. He owned a house that was originally part of Treaty Rock Farm as a young married man, and then as an older married man, the second house on Meeting House Lane, and that's important later. Primus's daughter, Lucy, inherits the house and lives there for many years. She lived into her 90s, so she was here living in Little Compton for almost the entire 19th century. And on the 1870 map, she's referred to as Miss Collins on the map, right here in the center. In her old age, she has no children. She asked friends of the family, the Nicholsons. The Nicholsons' mom was Elizabeth Cook of Dartmouth. Elizabeth couldn't sort of take care of Lucy, but her children could. So Pardon Nicholson and his wife Essie moved from Providence to move in with Lucy and take care of her in her old age. In exchange, they received the farm. Patton was a horseman. In Providence, they called it a hostler, someone who would take care of horses at inns, so he had some expertise. He was the Burchard family's carriage man. There's a name for that, it's escaping me. Carriage driver, took care of the horses for the Burchard family, who owned the large house on the corner, Old Acre. We hear stories about the people who lived in this cellar hole. We hear stories about Lucy from older historians. This is David Patton. He wrote about Primus, he wrote about Lucy, he wrote about the Nicholsons, who he referred to as the Nickersons. David Patton repeated what people told him. So his secondary sources may not always be reliable. But what I love about him is that he, from the time he was a little boy, was a very keen observer. So if he saw something with his own eyes, it really rings authentically to me. So he witnessed the poverty of the Nicholson family. Even though they worked for one of the wealthiest families in town, they lived in poverty, especially after Patton died. And in around 1900, they moved out of town after the death of Patton, and actually did really quite well in Connecticut and Providence and other places where there was more and different work for them to do. But this is an interesting thing. He talks about the house. It was a bare, forlorn, and very old house, standing alone in fields that have grown up with wild trash. I doubt if anyone goes up the overgrown path these days to see nothing but ruins. Now, Patton is probably writing this in the 1950s. So if we believe him, in the 1950s, there was a ruined house back there. That is in direct conflict with a really kind of an interesting story about the house that's been repeated many times, that it was burned on purpose by arsonists on the 4th of July in 1906, after the Nicholson family left Little Compton. Our source for the story about the house burning is the memory of a 3-year-old girl. Susan Sheether Witten remembers and talks about, did an oral history in Johnny Cakes and Cream about being carried out on the shoulders of her family servant to see the house burn down when she was 3 years old. So we believe that story, and we've repeated that story many times. And one of the things when we were, making arrangements with Holly is I told her that story because we expected to see evidence of that fire during the dig. I'm not going to talk about what we found during the dig. I'll just talk about history. 2 big questions. Who built the house? If you look at just the historic record, there's 2 good possibilities. First, that it's a very late 17th century house built by John and Rebecca Church sometime shortly after their marriage in 1693. The second choice is Ebenezer and Hannah Church, not when they inherited the property or purchased the property in 1756, but there's a couple of stories, not primary source records, but a couple of stories floating around that say that Ebenezer built the house in 1771. The deeds show that there was a house there from the time of John Church, and every time the property changes hands, they mention a house. So there was always a house. Whether sometime there were 2 houses, whether an old house was replaced by a new house, that we cannot see in the written documents. Conflicting oral traditions, the family story is that John, the second generation, built the house. Other stories say Ebenezer built it. There's a quote by Sarah Sol Wilbur, who I consider to be a great source because she saw it with her own eyes. Lucy Collins lives alone in her own house just south of the bridge of Meeting House Lane. Ebenezer Church, who lived to be 100, formerly lived there. So, again, I don't want to give away too much. There's some reason to think maybe the house is even earlier than what the paper records show, but Sarah's, not earlier, pardon me, more modern than what the paper, more modern than what the paper records show. But Lucy Collins' eyewitness account that Ebenezer Church lived there is a really good source and would take an awful lot of convincing for me to believe otherwise. Second question, was the house really burned by arsonists in 1906? I think even the historic record indicates that it was not. We mentioned earlier the Collins had 2 houses. If you look on this map by Sidney Burley, right up at the top, underneath Church's Point, the Collins' earlier house is on fire. So not the house on Meeting House Lane, but the house sort of behind Fred Bridge that was part of Treaty Rock Farm. That house is on fire in this map. And the Collins' house that was excavated is whole in 1925. That doesn't mean too much because he has Indian teepees on here too, so he blends his historical periods. But I think it's very important that we see a Collins house burning, and it's not the house we were investigating. Benjamin Franklin Wilbur refers to the house as still standing in the 1930s, and as all of you who are parents know, a 3-year-old is not a reliable source. So it's very likely that Susan was taken out to see the other house burning, perhaps, and maybe got confused. So that's where historical research leads me. I'm going to welcome Holly Herbster, senior archaeologist from the Public Archaeology Lab, to step up and tell us what the archaeology indicates. And these are some of our 8th graders working with one of the Pell archaeologists on the project.
Thank you, Marjorie, for setting the stage. And I want to, right from the outset, say that the archaeological work that we did at PAL would not have been as comprehensive or as meaningful as it was if we didn't have this enormous amount of local historical research, expertly done, really clearly delineated historical research about the property. I work primarily in the field of cultural resource management archaeology, so most of the work that I do involves doing survey and excavation at locations where there's going to be some type of development. So we do our work as part of the federal, state and federal funding, permitting, licensing of projects. And most of the time, I don't get to pick a site to go out and find. I'm given a project area, and my job is to go out and see if there's anything of interest in that project area. So to have the opportunity to work on this incredibly collaborative project with Marjorie and her volunteers from the Little Compton Historical Society, who are also community members, who also have an understanding of and love for local history, is an absolute treat and a project that I wish I could do 100% of the time. So thank you, Marjorie, and thank you to volunteers, any of you who, I think I see a few familiar faces. I think some of our volunteers are here. But I just wanted to say that this is a type of archaeological project that doesn't really happen that often, and it really represents the best of what you can do with as Marjorie said, a not insignificant amount of money, but the ability to harness, local eager volunteers to help tell the story, because that's really what we do as archaeologists. We're trying to tell a story. We're working, just like the historians, with an incomplete record. Even if we excavated 100% of an archaeological site, we would still only be picking up a fraction of the materials that were left behind. A huge portion of the material culture that's left in New England has just disappeared, has just either eroded away or just disintegrated in our really heavily acidic soil. So the things that remain, the things that are left behind, are usually the things that are made of the hardest and most non-porous materials. So things like stone and ceramic and brick. Wood doesn't survive very well. Organic materials and cloth don't survive very well. So even when we're talking about a site from the 1900s, a lot of the material that would have been deposited in the ground has actually disappeared. So that being said, this is just a little bit of a background about the project that we did. As Marjory mentioned, the Historical Society raised the funds to pay for the survey, and then also offered to provide volunteer support both in the field and in the laboratory, which made a significant difference in sort of the overall cost of the project. The work that we did and all of the archaeological work that gets done in Rhode Island and also in the surrounding states is done under a permit issued by the State Historic Preservation Office. That ensures that the work that we do meets methodological standards, that we collect information in a careful way, and that we present a report at the end of the project that details the results and that information is made available to the public. It also includes a provision to make sure that the artifacts are maintained in a secure and safe storage area, that they're carefully cleaned and housed in acid-free, breathable bags and boxes so that they don't disintegrate over time. The project that we did was really just to take a small sample of the site that Marjory talked about, this cellar hole that's visible on the ground surface. Our goal was not to excavate everything away from this site. The property's owned by the Nature Conservancy. There's no threat for the site to be destroyed or impacted. Again, kind of a different situation than what I'm used to. Normally I go into a project because an area is about to be developed. This property is safe and secure with no plans to destroy the archaeological site. So we wanted to be very careful with our testing to only do the smallest amount of excavation that we needed to help collect information to answer these questions. And the reason that we do that is twofold. One is that archaeology by its very nature is destructive. When we dig something up out of the ground, the second that it's removed from the soil that it's been deposited in, it's lost about 90% of its information value. So it's really important to collect material in a careful way to note where it's coming from in the soil, but also once you take it out of the ground, you'll never be able to recreate that site. So we take very seriously the responsibility as archaeologists to be stewards and to protect archaeological resources for the future. We also, even in my lifetime as an archaeologist, doing this for 30 years now, when I started, we didn't have technology like ground penetrating radar. We didn't typically use metal detectors to help identify locations on the ground where there may be metallic objects. There are all types of techniques that are being developed and will continue to be developed so that there's a good possibility that in the future we'll be able to learn something about an archaeological site without actually having to excavate it. So a big part of what we try to do, and a message that I like to get out there, is that it's great to collect information, it's great to have objects and material to help tell a story, but wherever possible we like to leave a site as much alone as we can. So with that being said, talking a little bit about the history of this property and its use, it began in the historical records with the Church family and the Euro-American settlers who came to the Little Compton area. But as you know, the homelands of the Wampanoag and Narragansett peoples and the Sakonnet tribe in particular in this area, those folks have been around for 10,000, if not longer, years and have lived on the land over that entire time. And it's not unusual at all for us when we're out doing survey in an area that even has been pretty heavily developed to collect pieces of material that were left behind by Native folks as they were traveling through an area or hunting or fishing or gathering resources. And really, it was no surprise to us that we did collect some of that material in the test pits that we dug within this historic site area. So the artifacts that you see on the screen are all made out of white quartz, the two on the top, and they are representative of the material type that we found. Everything we found on the site was made out of this white quartz material. A lot of what we collected, around 60 pieces of this stone, were pieces of, we call it chipping debris, the chipped stone. That is the byproduct of somebody making a stone tool, knapping a tool. We did, though, identify this image that's right here. I think that's showing up hopefully on the screen, is a small quartz projectile point that would have been hafted onto the end of an arrow. And right next to it is a larger portion of a triangular tool that was on its way to becoming a finished projectile but had not been completed. Both of these tool types, unfortunately for us in our desire to try and date things very specifically, they both come over a very wide range of time. They were manufactured for a period that could have spanned 1,000 years. So unfortunately, we're not able to tell exactly when these tools were made or deposited on the site. We also collected them in soils that have been disturbed in the historic period. So in other words, the exact spot where these tools or these chipped stones were dropped in the ground had been disturbed later on when the Collins and Nicholson and Church families came through and were using the property. So we don't know exactly when these tools were deposited. In fact, it's entirely possible that Native people were either working on the farm, visiting, were friends of, were visiting with the Collins family in the 1800s. It's entirely possible that some of these tools were made or deposited during that period. So really, they could represent anywhere from 3,000 or 4,000 years ago up into the 1800s. We don't really have enough information to tell us exactly when they were deposited. What I can tell you, though, is that the natural environment where this site is would have been really conducive to native land use over thousands of years. You had the beautiful brook that flowed probably much more quickly and was much larger before it was dammed up in the historic period. You have numerous wetlands around the cellar hole site. Very close to the coast, so there would have been access to all types of resources. So it's not unusual, it's not surprising at all to me that these tools showed up on this historic site. We also found two unusual artifacts that we can't, at this point, date to either the Native American period of use or the historic period of use. These two black objects in the bottom left of the screen are pieces of graphite, natural graphite, a mineral that can be found locally, perhaps in the glacial till, but also regionally, there are some sources where graphite is mined. It's a soft material. Graphite, obviously, originally used to make pencils and pencil lead back in the day. But these are two natural pieces of stone that both have human-made grooves or lines on both surfaces of them. And we know that Native people used graphite as a pigment and also as a way to sharpen, used it as a whetstone type tool to sharpen or smooth either stone or wooden objects. And we also know that graphite was occasionally used for the same purpose by colonists, to either smooth or hone tools. So again, we have these two pieces. We don't know exactly when they date to. They're part of the intrigue and mystery of the site, and they're some of the more unusual and not really easily datable artifacts from the site. So as I mentioned, we wanted to limit our testing as much as possible, but we also wanted to get good coverage across this wonderfully cleared project area. It's another real it was another real bonus for me. I'm used to having to hack my way through, the brush and the briars to come out to this beautifully cleared cellar hole that you see here in the bottom right. And the site that was sort of the focus of our work was this shallow depression, so bermed up around the outer edges, which would have been the foundation walls of the house. And then it's a little difficult to see maybe in the picture, but probably better on the big screen. You can kind of see a mound in the center of that depression, and that would have been the base of the chimney. So the house in those images that Marjory showed had a center chimney, which would have been typical for a house of that period, and it would have sat on probably a very large fieldstone base that then the brick of the chimney was placed above it. So that center hump that you're looking at is the chimney fall or the chimney base that would have been in the middle of the house. So we focused our work on and around that cellar hole, but we also wanted to make sure we put some of our test pits out in the yard area. We were partially looking for evidence of outbuildings or features that didn't show up in some of the maps and photographs in the 1900s. Archaeologists always love to find outhouses if we can find them. The outhouse or privy is basically a treasure trove for an archaeologist because materials fell into the privy accidentally when people were using it. But even more than that, when a privy became too full to use anymore, it often became a primary trash dump for not just household waste, but also broken objects and artifacts. So it often can be a time capsule if you're an archaeologist. And because the soil has a lot of organics in it, that's the one place in a New England really acidic soil context that you can sometimes find preserved organic materials. So unfortunately, we haven't yet located the privy on this site, but you know, needle in a haystack, we can always hope. The image on the upper left here is a wonderful drone image that shows the site from above, and you can see the clearing area around it. You can actually see some of the outline of the cellar hole, and then down below you can see the mound of the center chimney. There was a lot of debris on top of the cellar hole, which is not unexpected at a site like this. Clearly, people have been dumping material there after the site was no longer occupied. Some of what we found on the surface was collected by Marjory and some of the volunteers. It was kind of a mixture of older 19th century materials and some more modern materials. But in general, the site was pretty clean and pretty well preserved when we got there. As Marjory mentioned, we also were interested in looking in the side and backyards. There is a covered well, which is kind of to the back of the house, and that's the capping stone that's been put over the well here. And you can also see it here on this plan. And then we had what looked like a small enclosure, a very low row of field stones that were almost imperceptible. You wouldn't have seen them if the site hadn't been cleared. I mean, they just would have looked like rocks on the surface. You couldn't actually see the line of the foundation until it was cleared. And you can see a little bit of it in this photo, just along the edge of the cleared area. And then we also had some sections of stone wall that we assumed were probably internal yard divisions and possibly represented either pasture or field boundaries, or potentially could have been built around a smaller barn or other structure. So we did some of our testing in and around these foundations to try and get a sense of what we thought their function might have been, if they dated to the period when the house was occupied, if we were finding similar older, younger materials, etc. So the field work that we did was done, as I mentioned, very carefully. Everything is excavated in 10-centimeter levels, so about 4 inches at a time, with a shovel, occasionally with a trowel. Each level of the soil from a test pit is screened through 1/4-inch cloth, hardware cloth. We collect the material, we bag it by level and depth, and that's part of the way that we do our analysis to help try and date the site and figure out sort of what was going on, the evolution of the site. Each one of the test pits gets recorded on one of these forms, and you can see here, these are the different soil levels that we recorded as we did our excavation. Most of the site contained disturbed or filled soil, so soils that have been dug up and redeposited over time, which is pretty typical. You would expect to see that on a historic site that had been occupied over a period that could have spanned as much as 200 years. And that was another reason why with those Native American artifacts, because they were in these disturbed soils, we weren't able to really get a good sense of how old they might be. And the volunteers did the digging and the screening with us. So we had typically 2 or sometimes 3 volunteers paired with a pal archaeologist. The volunteers were picking materials out of the screen, and we were sort of there to just do the recording and to make sure that if there was any question about an artifact, we were able to keep our eyes on it, which is part of that requirement with the professional permit to make sure that even though the archaeology was done very collaboratively and we had volunteers involved in all aspects of it, there was also always someone there with a set of trained eyes to be able to identify something. And we didn't always know what things were, so some of it just came back to be analyzed later. When we got back to the lab, we excavated 19 small shovel test pits, so small 2.5 foot test pits. At the end of that process, we had collected slightly more than 1,000 pieces of cultural material. We didn't collect every single piece of bottle glass, every single broken brick fragment that we found. We record all of that information in the field, but for some materials that are not really diagnostic and aren't going to tell us a lot of information. We typically don't bring every single piece of that type of material back. We do a sampling strategy. So what we collected and brought back was just slightly more than 1,000 pieces of cultural material. Of that total, about 60 pieces or so were interpreted as Native American artifacts. Again, primarily, it was almost all quartz. We had a couple of pieces of what we identified as fire-cracked rock. So rock that had been heated up and then cracked open. It's a type of material that you typically see associated with Native American, small Native American campsites. It's not as typical to see on a colonial site, so we interpreted those as being part of the Native American assemblage. And then about 1,000 or so artifacts that date to the post-contact period. And so by post-contact, I mean manufactured sometime after about 1600, after the period when the earliest colonial settlers came here. Many of the objects manufactured in England and Europe, but some of them also manufactured locally or in North America. As I mentioned, our volunteers, just like with the Manton Farm Project, came in, Marjory and her crew came in, and they cleaned every one of these 1,000+ artifacts by hand, each piece of material. Again, all done very carefully, taken out of its bag, cleaned and maintained in the level at which it was collected. Anything that is sturdy gets typically washed with water and a toothbrush. Things like shell or material that's more delicate gets dry brushed. Metal typically gets dry brushed so we don't get it wet again. And then everything gets cataloged. We have a computer cataloging system that's a hierarchical ranking of materials. So after everything gets input into our system, we're able to do all sorts of cool sorting and querying, and I'm able to tell exactly what came out of what test pit, or where were the nails on the site, or what depths were the nails at. It's a wonderful thing to be able to do all this kind of manipulation with your data in the lab when you get back. So I'll talk a bit about the materials that we collected, just go through things kind of briefly here. Structural materials, as you could imagine, made up a pretty big percentage of what we found. We were trying to dig around the cellar hole primarily. One of the things that is a little bit of a telltale sign for an earlier site is that we had several handmade bricks. This is an example of one in this slide. Handmade bricks were made into the 19th century, but typically when we see them as part of building material at a site, they date to the earlier period. Certainly in the 1600s, all of the brick that was being used for construction in New England was being made locally by hand in brick molds, and it wasn't until later that it was kind of manufactured on a more industrial scale. We found pieces of a lime-based mortar, which again would be a typical thing to find in a locally made earlier house. Some examples of slate floor tiles. We know that outside of the house, particularly behind the house near what may have been a back door, we had some slate that was natural but that had been shaped and modified and may have been used to create sort of a terrace or a, I won't call it a patio because that's not what it would have been, but just an area behind the back door, possibly for work or for activities. Window glass fragments, so obviously, again, you would expect that. And we found about 200 nails, which is not a huge number for a house of the size that would have been there. Of that, about half of them were machine-cut nails. We can tell that by the shape and the style of the nail. And machine-cut nails were manufactured primarily from about 1790 to 1900. So prior to 1790, you would not see machine-cut nails in a structure. That's one of the ways that we help date a structure, is the types of nails. We did have some examples of hand-wrought nails. A lot of the nails that we found were heavily corroded, and it was difficult to tell exactly what their manufacturing type was. So we know there were some earlier hand-wrought nails, but by and large, the material that we collected was machine-cut nails. Glass is another material that obviously preserves really well in our soil, but it gets really easily heavily fragmented. And a lot of the material that we found on this site was very small, so it had been very broken up over time. We didn't find a lot of large pieces of artifacts, which to my mind suggests that materials broke while they were being used and were probably deposited in and around the yard area as trash, as opposed to just being left behind as whole objects. Some of the materials that we found included, beverage servingware, as well as medicine bottles, bottles that probably were used for either alcohol or other beverages. Again, the vast majority of them dated probably their manufacture date, based on what we can tell, to the period of the 1800s, but we had some pieces that were earlier and some pieces that were later. We also found a number of, we're able to identify lamp glass, so from a kerosene lamp, that lamp glass was part of the assemblage as well. The ceramics for us are really, as archaeologists, this is one of our most telltale, datable materials. We know from historical research and from catalogs the date ranges of different types of ceramics. And the larger the piece and the more of a design element it has, the more definitively we're able to date it. So in other words, if we have a maker's mark or a particular pattern on a ceramic, we often can tell within a period of 50 to 100 years when it was manufactured. Now that tells us when it was manufactured. That doesn't necessarily tell us when the material was used, because as all of us know, you have objects, you have plates and dishes and pieces in your collection that are passed down from one generation to the next. So it would not be at all unusual for a household in the 1850s to have some heirloom pieces of material that were passed down from, parents and grandparents that maybe were manufactured in the 1700s or the 1600s. A lot of the ceramics that we found at this site were redwares, so red clay, very utilitarian, kind of, I don't want to really call it the Tupperware of its day, but that's sort of what it was. It was, or the hotelware of its day. It was very, very cheap. Came in a lot of different forms: milk pans, saucers, jars, jugs, plates, bowls, colanders. Redware was ubiquitous in the 1600s, the 1700s, and even into the first half of the 1800s. It was sturdy, it was cheap. So finding a lot of redware at a site is not necessarily a clue to date when it comes, when it was manufactured or when it was used. We had a couple of redware pieces that had distinctive lead glazes on the outside of them, and this piece that is on this slide in the bottom right is a piece of redware with a black lead glazed surface, and that is an earlier piece. That style of redware was manufactured in the first half of the 18th century. We also, directly above that piece, is a piece of German gray stoneware that is also a piece that would have been manufactured in the late 1600s, early 1700s. So we do have some earlier ceramics at the site. But just like with the machine-cut nails, the majority of the datable ceramics at this site are of a material called pearlware. And you can see a piece of pearlware on the slide on the left. This is a piece of blue feathered pearlware, the white shirred with the blue kind of trailing lines on it. And pearlware was manufactured during a very specific time period between 1775 and 1830. So again, seeing pearlware on the site indicates it wouldn't have been there any earlier than the last quarter of the 18th century. So ceramics for us at this site were not sort of a dead giveaway, but they helped us kind of identify when the property would have been used. We had some limited food remains. We didn't find any large trash pits that were just filled with food waste. And again, it may just be due to the fact that we sort of did a pick and choose kind of strategy for our testing. We found some oyster and clamshell, which, typical to find on a site. Also, cow and pig bone, especially the teeth. The teeth are really definitive and were quite exciting to us when we found them in the field. They show up as these, bright, shiny objects. They almost look like a piece of jewelry when you find them. Some of the bone showed evidence of butchering, so butcher marks. That means we know that was bone that was cut into with a metal knife, so dating to the colonial or historic period as opposed to the more ancient past. Most of the bone, just like the glass, was really fragmentary. We weren't able to identify it specifically by species, but we think for the most part the bone primarily comes from domesticated animals that would have been on the property when the families were living there. A couple of smoking pipes. Again, you can often date a pipe based on the design of the bowl, and sometimes by the diameter of the bore in the clay pipe, but you typically need a large assemblage of those pipes to be able to do that kind of dating. The pieces that we collected were really small. We didn't find very many of them, just a little bit more than a dozen. So it gives us a sense of what people were doing in their everyday life on the site. Men and women both smoked pipes. So it's not uncommon to find these on the site at all. And again, really points to an occupation date in the late 1600s, but more likely in the 17 and 1800s. And then these are just a couple of the cool or unusual or interesting finds. We didn't find treasure. We didn't find a hoard of coins, but we did find an 1881 Indian head penny. So that was kind of exciting, and certainly fits right into the time period when we would expect to find the site. We seem to, on both of our projects now with Marjory, find some sort of what to me is a little creepy portion of a doll head. In this case, we have this, it's actually beautiful, a porcelain bisque piece of a child's doll that has the painted eyebrows on top, and you can see the eye sockets down below. We found about 4 pieces that may or may not be from the same doll, but they were spread out in a couple of different test pits, so not sure if they're just one doll that broke and then the pieces got kind of scattered about, or if there was more than one. Another really interesting piece that we found here, this is a key for a pocket watch. So something that you would only have seen in a watch probably from the 1800s. There used to be a key that you would put in prior to the time when the stem would have a winding mechanism. You would actually put a key into the watch to wind it up. That was an unusual and interesting find. This piece right here, to the undiscerning eye, it may look like a blown out piece of a shotgun shell, but it's actually a piece of an umbrella or a parasol. It's that piece that would slide up and down on the shaft. It's called the runner to open and close the umbrella. An unusual, this is made out of a piece of a copper alloy, kind of an unusual thing to find at a site, and it took our lab staff a little while to figure out what that was, but thanks to the magic of reproduced Sears and Roebuck catalogs and online databases, they were able to figure out what that was. This is a little piece of a copper clothing grommet. Again, just kind of an unusual piece. This is a small carpet tack. So little tiny thing that we were able to collect from our field work. So what does the archaeology tell us? As I've said, we did very limited testing at this site, but we feel like we got a lot of good information out of it. We certainly documented that Native Americans were living in and around the site area, and that was something that wasn't necessarily part of the written history of the site, but is part of the overall history of Little Compton. And here's a location where we have this beautiful natural setting with wetlands and resources. And so we know that people were, utilizing this beautiful spot probably over thousands of years. Marjory talked about the fire, and I think she has now settled on the fact that the eyewitness who saw the house burn is probably the other house. But we definitely would have seen in the testing that we did, especially around the cellar hole, if that house had burned, if there was a standing house and it had burned, we would have seen evidence of that in the ground. We would have seen a burn layer, we would have seen materials, structural materials that were either burned or melted, and there was absolutely no evidence of that anywhere on the site. So that's one thing, even though archaeology is a lot of more questions than answers, that's one thing that I think that we can say definitively is that the house that sat on top of the cellar hole did not burn to the ground. Most of the materials that we're able to date fit into this time period when Lucy Collins would have been living in the house. And that makes sense because it sounds like, based on the historical research, she probably was the person who was there for the longest continuous period of time, with families coming and going. That being said, however, It would not be unusual if an earlier house was on this property and it was continuously occupied over several hundred years for the earliest and oldest material to be really hard to recognize. For one thing, going back further in time, people had less material goods, and those objects that they did have were more precious to them. So your sort of household objects were fewer, and they were harder to come by, and you were much more careful with them. You didn't have sort of the utilitarian mass-produced goods that you see by the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century. So it can be really hard to document the oldest period of occupation at a site. And one of the things that we've talked about, Marjory and I, is that going forward, if we go back to the site, we're probably going to want to focus some testing a little bit more closely on the foundation itself and open up some larger areas to try and see if we can find a builder's trench around that foundation and potentially see if we can tell the date maybe when that original foundation was put in, or if maybe even there was a smaller house that was enlarged over time, which is also really typical to see in a house of that period. We definitely were able to document at least one outbuilding, so that's supporting the historical record and the images of the house. We don't really know for sure if it was a small barn or some type of an animal pen, but we did find a number of animal bones in that area and some other debris, so that's a good bet that that's what it was. But we really were left, as is often the case with archaeology, with more questions than we had answers for. That's, to me, kind of fun, and one of the exciting things about doing what I do is that, you know, the artifacts tell you one part of the story, but there's always more to learn, and I think if we can continue to collect more historical information and maybe do some targeted additional testing out at this site, we may be able to come back to you in the next couple of years and provide some more house history, some more site history for this site. And with that, I just want to thank the volunteers and the students who came out, who I think some of them were not as excited as maybe we thought. They definitely didn't want to get dirty. They did not want to get dirty. There were a lot of white sneakers out at that site. But the students really got into it, I think, when they started doing some screening, and, you know, the grosser or weirder the piece of material was that they found, the more they were into it. So it was great to have the opportunity to have the students come out, and we wouldn't have been able to do this work without the volunteers who came out to the site. So with that, I thank you for your time. I thanks for the opportunity to talk with you. And I don't know if anyone has any questions. I know I'm sticking around afterwards. Everybody's probably ready for refreshments, but if anyone has questions for either Marjory or me, I will just stop there. Thank you again. What would you like to do, Marjory? Does anyone have any questions while we're still here, or? Yes.
So I might have missed it. The front of the house faced Meeting House or West Main?
The front of the house faced West Main.
Oh, yeah.
The laneway that would access the house is Nature Conservancy land from Meeting House Lane in. So you would have gotten to the house from Meeting House, but the front door faced west.
Yeah.
And would it have been visible, do you think?
Not from West Main Road, no. Not even from Meeting House Lane, it's pretty far back there.
Yeah. I mean, it would probably take, what, about at least 10 minutes to walk back to where the site is from the main road? Would you say? Yeah.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Now granted, with no, like, in the past, no trees, maybe you could see it. West Main Road with no trees, but you certainly couldn't see it now.
Yes.
You don't do any examination of old wells?
I myself have not excavated an old well primarily because they're dangerous, and we don't know how to really safely get down into them. This well that's on the site is mostly filled in. I mean, there's a cap over it, and you can look down into it, but between stone and soil that's filled in, it's not something you can look down and see all the way down into the bottom of it.
I think Jason put the cap back on it, or it's
Yeah. 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 I mean, I think to excavate a well safely, you would actually need to take it apart, and you'd need to open up a really large, you'd kind of need to open up an area, do sort of, you'd reverse engineer how the well would have been built, right? So the original well hole would have been probably a large sloping opening that would go down to the bottom of the depth when you wanted to put your well in, and then you would have built it up with stone and then filled in soil around it as you built it up. So if you were going to excavate, you would kind of have to do the same thing, open up a really large area around it and then sort of deconstruct the stone as you went down to be able to do it safely. All right. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. Thanks to people who were watching on Zoom. And Marjory has all my contact information, so if anyone has a follow-up, please feel free to reach out. And thank you again for having me.